Sunday supplement live, which is titled Affordability Examined, and it's going to take a look at affordability in both the rental and the sale market in UK property. So, as you'll know, I like to start with a quote if you've listened before, and this week's is the problem. Affordable housing has to be subsidised if the affordable bit of the phrase is going to work. The solution: replace every wall, ceiling and floor with a gigantic plasma screen and charge for advertising space. The affordable living room of tomorrow is a futuristic cube with a perpetually looping Go Compare commercial in place of carpets and wallpaper. And that's by Charlie Brooker, the satirist. Now, before I get started, I'd just like to encourage you all to buy your tickets for the next Property Business Workshop. That's Thursday the 16th of January 2025. Rod, Turner and I will be covering productivity, planning and financial accounting and bookkeeping. Why? Because we constantly see property businesses struggling with appropriate financial reporting, accounting and bookkeeping and making the same mistakes time and again. Help get a complete handle on the financial performance of your company or group when you aren't at a level yet where you can afford a CFO or financial controller. Set up correctly once and then just iterate from there. As always, it will be an action-packed, content-filled day which will stand alone in trying to help to advance your understanding as a property business owner. The link's live and there's just a couple of super early bird tickets left with a genuine 25% discount on the face value, and that's bit.ly/PBWFIVE. So welcome to the supplement proper, and we had a bit of a slower news week on the economic front compared to some of the more recent significant events, and as expected had a first look at the November auctions that we at our end as a group concentrate on. As predicted, it was a bit of a bloodbath. Lots were pulled left, right and centre, and successful lots limping over the line. Vendors went in with expectations too high, and buyers are simply sitting on their hands waiting and seeing, or expecting vendors to take the hit that is at least 2% to pay that extra SDLT, if not more. In the deep dive this week, I take a look at rent affordability. It's already a hot topic, but when you see the rent growth figures for October in the macro section, you'll understand why I think it's going to continue to be a hot topic for 2025. Into our standard fare then. Chris Watkin asked himself that question one more time. What's currently happening in the UK property market? This report was from the first calmer week without a budget, election or Bank of England meeting. Chris, guru of estate and letting agency stats, keeps pumping out the great content and is always pushing himself to find new ways of looking at the data. It's lovely stuff to a data geek like me. He reports on the UK portal data which is aggregated for him by 20EA on a weekly basis. I love real-time, or as near to real-time as possible, snapshots and pictures of the market that we can piece together. There's nothing better for staying informed. We have to analyse what has happened, but only really so we meaningfully try to predict what will happen. So listings stayed around 29,000 last week, similar to 2018, but higher than all of the other years for the last 8. You could say the same about almost all of this year though, as the 1.6 million listings so far are the highest over that period for a year. The market looks okay. In a flash, it seems, the 3.6% mortgage deals we did have are now clumping more around 4.3 for the owner-occupiers. Not horrific, but not much progress downwards in the past 12 months, although many will have managed to snag 4% or less this year with good timing. Sold subject to contracts improved to 24.2k, far higher than 2023, so 19% higher for the same week, and we're even further ahead of the pre-COVID averages than we have been, 8.5% above the 17 to 19 year to date. The fall throughs came right back to 25%, so back down to 25%, seeming to suggest the budget really had a minor impact on fall throughs. The fall through rate was 40% for 2 months after the trust quartering mess of 2022, and the 7-year average is 24.2%, so we're basically at the 7-year average again. Net sales still look good. They ticked up last week, and the only year with more net sales, which is, remember, gross sales minus fall through, was 2021. So a healthy print on the year, 6% above the pre-pandemic average of 2017 to 19 years now. There's more houses on the market now, though, 725,000 or thereabouts, than at any single time over the past 8 years. Or perhaps more. Chris himself would know the answer to that one. It can't possibly be that landlord sales are influencing the amount of stock out there, can it? What else could it be? Expect a drop come January, though, as people make decisions to give up if they can't get the price that they want. I'm going to say one more time though, remember about these newly reintroduced stamp duty bumps rather than cliff edges at 125 to 250 and 300 to 425 for the first time buyers. I've said over the past fortnight they will nudge behaviour the other way around in the first time and secondary markets, of course, in Q1 of 2025 and possibly before Christmas for the very well organised. Everyone paying over 125k is paying the extra, first time buyers aside, in the 125 to 250k band. And FTBs will likely be the most motivated because the marginal band between 300 and 425k is 5%. And so 7.5% of extra cash to find or to borrow from bank of mum and dad will force some transactions through before April the 1st, 2025. This will be prevalent in areas where first time buyer stock is over that 300,000 mark, which is of course is not the case in a lot of the country. Around 60% would expect to be under or around that sort of mark. You would expect from the point at which we're starting the impact to be more volume before the 1st of April and then less volume after, as the market adjusts to the transition, with future volume dependent on the pace of rate changes. So use this wisely. Don't compete if there's a scrum in Q1. Stick to your guns with a big effort in Q2 at the beginning to get the reductions that will pay the stamp duty difference 3 times over. Remember what this also means for anyone disposing of any stock. List your sales wisely. List now or soon. Certainly prepare to list on Boxing Day and get carried away with the usual hype, or make an impact in the first weekend of the new year after the kids are back to school. It really depends on what you're selling. Line up decent lawyers on your side as well. It does look like there'll still be plenty of stock on the market. I spoke of the auctions in the introduction, and I'm still seeing tumbleweed for the vendors right up until Christmas time. Stay keen, get your eyes open. There's bargains out there and a ton of lotted stock that isn't even being viewed, let alone offered on. This window of opportunity won't last long, but press your advantages if you're buying. One more takeaway from the real-time desk though. October's sold subject to contract figures showed £346 a foot, 1.5% up on July. In spite of the bearishness overall, things are moving north. My 5% prediction for the year now looks like it might settle around 4% or in the low 4s. I won't be too unhappy with being less than 1% out though if that does transpire. Not much of a bite into inflation for the year though. Will it be in the end? So get the macrometers out. It's time for the macro section. The nation saw the inflation, so we'll dive into that. The ONS private rent and house prices report is a must. And then we had the flash PMIs on Friday, and anyone who's listened before will know how much I love them. And then the gilts and swaps, of course. So, inflation. Some boring people, including me, have spent a lot of time talking about how it isn't dead, it will tick back up, etc., etc. I also went into some detail about why September's print was anomalously low, which was currency and oil fluctuations at the perfect time. It's an incredible stroke of luck for the new government, in fact, because so much hinges on September's inflation figure, and that keeps the cost down of index-linked benefits rises and the likes next year, and it keeps the people paying the real cost via frozen tax thresholds and the other choking effects of inflation. So 2.3% in October, with a 10% rise in the household energy cap to contend with. January's figure for the price cap looks like 1%, by the way, which is welcomed and lower than previous predictions. Would not have been considered a bad result by any means if it wasn't for that greatest of human fallibilities, benchmarking. Because we saw it, we tasted sub 2%. Those who only skimmed the top of the metrics wanted to stay at or under target. We knew there was limited chance unless Labour and the budget timing had affected the economy more than we realised. It seems not, and the consensus of 2.2% by the economists was missed to the upside as the print was 2.3%. In the round, 2.3% is fine. It's within tolerances, including the Bank of England tolerance. It's actually low compared to some estimates from 12 months back. I'd certainly consider it acceptable. But as I'm turning into a broken record on this subject matter amongst others, the new post-COVID world sees 3% inflation as much more of the norm, or maybe better framed as there being a 1% bump on old days inflation. The downside is the bond market's reacting and demanding higher returns, which mean higher rates. The upside is higher wages, higher rents, and more erosion of nominal debt. Then we get into the further detail, the bit that doesn't make the headlines. CPIH. This is the metric the ONS prefers, including housing costs. Putting them into inflation, that's back over the 3% mark, back to 3.2, printed 2.6 in September. We know the figure including housing is going to be above the overall figure, likely for the next 2 or even 3 years, as we slowly wean ourselves off the cheap money and fewer landlords enter the market to rent under the current conditions. The month-on-month CPIH increase was 0.6%, which is much more concerning, of course. Anything over 0.5% is worrying, but some of this is just an adjustment from a low print in September given the macro landscape, as I said. CPI was also 0.6 month-on-month, so that will be watched closely for next month's figures. Black Friday theoretically knocks money off the goods side, of course, but it only has a very limited impact in the services side, which defines half of CPI as it goes. In arguably one of the best and certainly the most underpublished measures of inflation, core CPIH was up 4.1% in October from 4% in September. Core CPI was up 3.3%. You can see why, underneath it all, it's been easy to call the rebound from September's numbers, and also why I think 3% is the new 2% as inflation goes for the next several years. Those who have read an inflation update before will know I also like to look at OOH, the owner-occupier measure of housing costs. This still sits below 5% below CPI or CPIH since 2015. 2015 is used as the base year by the ONS until next year, when I believe they'll move the base year to 2020, although they might not do that because that would not be a very good base year to be gauging anything on for obvious reasons. So this is likely to move at a faster rate, OOH, than either of the other two over the next couple of years for the reasons already discussed. But OOH still has not found its high in this cycle. It moved from 7.2 to 7.4 in October, a new high since 1992. Services CPI topped 5% again. Services CPIH was back up to 5.6%. Neither of these are particularly helpful for Bank of England cuts, and indeed the headlines this week reflected the fact that December cuts are largely considered off the table and the next cut is February, which I agree with, although it could be even later. We just need to see how the economy settles down after the budget, when we get more towards reality and less towards all businesses being ever so concerned about it. Where is that impact actually going to fall? Closures, prices for consumers, wages, jobs. It's ultimately what we've got to find out. Now, it does depend, right? The bond yields might have found a little top in this cycle, it seems, and they're coming back down a little as we speak. But let's see when we get to the PMIs. So the energy picture also showed a price rise, as we knew. The price cap was up 10%. That's the one that makes the headlines. But in October, electricity prices went up 7.7% and gas prices went up 11.7%. They do typically go up at this time of year, but they're now only 22% and 36% below their peaks in recent years, which obviously were very, very high. Gas prices are still 88% higher than March 2021, and electricity prices are still 56% higher. So you can measure the pain in today's money over that time period compared to a headline inflation rate since then of around about 25%. Enough on inflation. We conclude what's already been said for the course of 2024. It isn't over. The battleground is now in the 2 to 3% or 2 to 3.5% region, and it isn't moving from there anytime soon, looking at the core figures here. There's a stubborn tail which is often 18 plus months long in these situations, particularly after a pandemic style event, as opposed to a war style event, for example, which hopefully we can avoid. The ONS private rents and house prices then. Rents, unlike in the major headlines from portals who are telling us that rent rises have calmed right down, are up 8.7% in the 12 months to October 2024. That's up from September's 8.4%. House prices side by side increased 2.9% in the 12 months to September 24. They're always a month behind the rents. Framed another way, yields increased by 5.3%. So 7% yield would become 7.375 over the course of September 23 to September 24. Quite an increase, really. 9.2 is the cycle high as at March 2024. So this tick up is not far off that high point. The pace at which this moves, which is relatively slowly, suggests that a fair stab for 12 months' time would be around 6.5%. Why is this so different from the portals that are publishing rent rises of 2% or less? Because they only measure new rents, which is what they're advertising. The ONS sample contains over 500,000 private rents, of which nearly 80% are existing rents and just over 20% are new rents. The 2.9% house price rise splits as follows: 2.5% in England, only 0.4% in Wales, 5.7% in Scotland and 6.2% in Northern Ireland. And as we go within England, the north is pushing forward, perhaps because it's the only viable rental market for investors entering the market using leverage, simply because of yields and the cost of debt. And it travels downwards as we travel down the country in a really quite orderly fashion from north to south. None of this is outside of the parameters suggested for 2024, and there's a limited amount of quick change expected in this market. Stable and relatively slow around inflation growth in prices. Rents rising well beyond current inflation, and wage increases based on it being much slower to move in the first place than prices were. It's catch-up time, simply. Yields are having to rise to enable leveraged landlords to keep anywhere near pace with the huge increases in mortgage rates that they've been facing. Okay, let's move on to the PMIs. Hoping they would pick up after the budget? Before this, I wasn't really expecting them to after the employers' national insurance rises, though. Guess what? A terrible print. A 13-month lower composite index, 49.9, as any growth is squeezed out of the economy. The expectation for Q4's growth is now worse than I said last week at this point. Last week I said between 0.1 and minus 0.1. I'd probably frame that range now as 0 to minus 0.2. What a tragedy after a good start to the year. Services kept pace at 50.0, but the strapline said it all. Sustained drop in private sector employment amid weaker business optimism and rising cost inflation in November. Some businesses will, of course, responded to the budget quite quickly and started putting prices up in November in preparation for the NI hikes in April 2025. This doesn't set the scene for a big growth rate next year, unless all that growth is coming from the public sector and government spending, of course. And remember, some of it will be. The report points to job losses and falling output. Not hugely, marginal would be a better description, but business optimism is now lower than it has been since the car crash budget of 2022. The very last sentence of the report's analysis is one more kick in the happy sacks. Wage-related price and cost growth in the service sector potentially limits scope for rate cuts among the more hawkish policymakers. But let's not be too miserable. Business will recover and buck its ideas up. It will take just a bit of time, perhaps 6 months, and we'll be on an upward path. Come on then, let's let the gilts cheer us up for a change. Well, Friday was a down day on the back of these PMIs. We opened the week on the 5-year gilt of 4.352 on the yields and closed it at 4.249. Just under my range roof at the moment of 4.25%. The swap accordingly preserved that 30 basis points discount and closed under 4% at 3.954 on Friday, and is still about 0.2% cheaper than 12 months ago. Slowly catchy monkey. Have we found our bearish top once again, or are the yields falling in the expectation of possible rate cuts in the face of a recession? Well, expect further bad news economically as we approach Christmas, and thus lower yields. But how much lower? Let's just enjoy 10 points shaved off the yield, 6 points shaved off the swap, and hope for a bit more of that, I think. Pricing remains at 6% or thereabouts for no-fee 5-year limited company fixes, and about 8.6% for investment-grade gross yields on a typical UK house that you might want to buy as an investment property. Probably 1% or so above the typical yield right now, which means, if you accepted that yields were distributed normally, that around 1/3 of the areas in the UK are viable to buy new rentals in. Now, if you were doing HMO or other active asset management strategies, then it would open up more areas than that. But it's quite a frightening conclusion, isn't it? Under the PRI guidelines of 125% rent cover on a mortgage, that rent comes down to 7.5%, probably putting around half of UK housing on the table for viable rentals. I suggest that's exactly what they will see play out in terms of people entering the rental market. Luckily, the incumbents will keep on buying in areas where they already have assets or a portfolio, and they know what works and they know how to press their own edges. Luckily for the tenants, otherwise there would be no new supply at all in half of the country with the current figures looking like they do. Okay, let's get stuck into one of the topics that's going to remain hot for the rest of this Parliament one way or another. Rent affordability. The ONS snuck out a report. I'm kidding, they weren't trying to hide anything, it was just rather busy around that time, at the end of October about this, and I haven't had the bandwidth to look at this until now. This covers England and Wales, as a lot of the ONS data does. The report found that a private renter on a median household income could expect to spend 34.2% of their income on a median price rented home in England, compared to 27.2% in Wales. This only, ridiculously, goes up until March 2023. Perhaps a note on why This is so far behind in real time, and this tells you why the government moves so slowly. The English Housing Survey is the Bible as far as the government is concerned. The 22-23, with March 23 being the final date, survey was published in December 23. Why the report takes 10 months, I can't tell you. Well, I can have a guess. There's a pipeline of work, it gets prioritised, and that's the priority it's been assigned. Still, some of this relates back to what's been said in the private rents and also the inflation section. If we look back to 2015, we see the conclusion that despite private rents increasing since 2015 and at a faster rate since 2022, incomes of private renting households in England and Wales have increased at a faster rate, leaving affordability at a broadly similar level at financial year end 23 compared to 2015. Now, let's bear something else in mind. Rents have moved up since then, a lot in the ONS sample data. However, incomes have also moved up quite a lot, so the situation won't have deteriorated massively from here. It won't be better, but it won't be a lot worse. Rents rarely outside London reach 35% of household income, even though many affordability tests do allow tenants up to 40% of their income outside London. London goes into the 50s, of course, particularly in certain areas. The most affordable rent was North Lincolnshire, 18.8% of median income, and the least affordable was Kensington and Chelsea at 52.2%. But you can see here the folly of just relying on a percentage. The cost of living in London is higher, of course. They charge you to move and breathe down there. I'm joking, of course. Strangely, though, some things are cheaper. Public transport would be one, simply because of the volume of people moving around. The real marker here would be a base cost remaining each month to live on, because energy is often the same price, although there can be regional fluctuations. Food is not markedly different in pricing, and Netflix costs the same across regions. So, there may be a few other surprising conclusions here as well. Out of 334 local authorities in England and Wales, 233, that's 70%, had a median rent that was affordable, and that's classed by the ONS as below 30% of income. That's the highest number since this data series began in 2015. So, this 30% the ONS uses is a bit disconnected from the rest of the industry. There can be a debate around this, and you'd expect a more accurate number maybe to be around 35%, between the industry that pushes things a little and the ONS. The final ONS conclusion won't surprise anyone. The LAs with the least affordable median rents in each region in 2023 were those in urban centres such as London, Manchester, Brighton and Hove, Bristol and Bath. But if you measure on percentage, that is what's going to happen. An urban lifestyle will come at a higher cost quite often, because it probably means more social events, more eating out, convenience, etc, etc. But city centre salaries are better though, of course, partially to reflect this. The graph on affordability, which is titled so as to completely miss the monster conclusion from this report, has been included as this week's image. The ONS prefers rents in England are on average less affordable than in Wales. This one is only a workable conclusion if you accept that the percentage methodology is good, which, as I've discussed, it isn't. It might be the least worst, of course, but that doesn't make it good. What it does show is that, totally contrary to the broader opinion and groundswell out there, affordability in England has improved really significantly from 39.9% in 2016, the heady days of the peak rental market before George's policies kicked in to make it stall, then fall in terms of supply, to 34.2% in 2023. That's a 14.29% increase in affordability. Now, the guardians of the world would tell you this is a lie, of course. How can it be true? Well, because rents didn't go up much from 2016 to 2021, and also because incomes have moved quite a lot, especially the median income, due to policies from successive governments to press the minimum wage and any associated wages up quite aggressively. Remember, as I said at the start though, this only takes us to March 2023. It really is quite seismic as far as data conclusions go, and will form part of why passionate representations by Generation Rent and the likes around rent controls will be rebuffed by the government in the conversations around the Renters' Rights Bill currently going through the Commons. That, plus the fact that even the Labour Housing Group, who are suitably left-wing, accept that rent controls do not work, although they would like to see rent stabilisation, where rents only go up by inflation during a tenancy. An annual rise at inflation would have been much worse for tenancies up until the previous couple of years. And even then, it would have meant huge increases at the time of huge inflation, rather than lagged increases, which is what we're seeing now. Their next figure tells a story that backs that up. Since 2015 in England, median income is up 39.6%. Remember that next time someone is moaning, compared to inflation at 27.3% and rents at 23.5. This is CPI, and again, only till March 23. Now, considering this report's going to take another 11 months to appear again, unless it gets a new level of priority, the next one will show those two figures converge. CPI was down to 3.2 in March 24, so that takes inflation to 31.4 over the period. Rents were up 9.1 according to the ONS index, which puts that number to 34.7 over the period, just ahead of inflation. But median household income will have moved up 5% or more in the same period. The exact number comes from a DWP survey that is not yet available, but that's an okay proxy, or probably an underestimate. That'll move incomes up to 46.6% increased over the period. So above inflation, definitely, rents, but only just, not above income increases. There's still a couple of years there of headroom, even if rents stayed higher than my estimates. I'd imagine March 25 will be printing around 7.5% rental increases for the year at the ONS, and income still around 4.5% or so for the median household, then calming down a bit to 5.5% rental increases in March 25, with incomes moving around 3.5% over that period. But those are only ballpark figures, of course. The ONS also conclude another interpretation of these statistics is therefore that there continue to be enough households who earn enough to occupy the private rented housing stock in England and Wales. I'd suggest at the moment there's more than enough from what we see in the rental market on a daily basis. It also won't surprise you to note that the only regions that on average exceed this comparatively arbitrary 30% threshold are London, the South East and the North West, where rent growth is perhaps more difficult to see, versus areas like the East Midlands and Yorkshire. The West Midlands is the most affordable on the ONS numbers of all the regions, so arguably has the most rent growth headroom. The next couple of years in the data world, where 75% of it in the real world has already happened, won't paint a pretty picture. But really, this shows, aside from anything else, why real-time conclusions are so much more important than waiting for the full picture. By the time the government gets around to concluding what we feel now we already know, thanks to this analysis, the situation will be repairing itself and rents will be moving around the 3.5% mark, alongside incomes and potentially alongside inflation, as I've said. Then any intra-tenancy controls that might or might not be introduced, unlikely, but give it a couple more years of bad data, like I said, on stuff that we already know has happened, and political pressures will change and rent controls might well start being actively talked about before the end of this parliament. By which point rent controls, if they are intra-tenancy, so when the market rent has been found at the start of a tenancy, and then we're talking during that, they won't be a terrible thing because all rents will have caught up to the level where they need to be in a world with a hostile environment to landlords, 5% stamp duty for new entrants, and a significantly increased interest rate compared to the 2010s when rents could actively be lower, but they weren't. Now look, this is just my 2 penneth worth, of course, but I'm really interested to hear from you if you agree or disagree. Zoopla also snuck out an October report on affordability, which I wanted to throw into the mixer here. They blend affordability on purchase with rental affordability, which makes it more difficult to directly compare the two, but I do respect the Zoopla real-time data, and that makes it worth pursuing as a comparison. So when you put it next to buying, 40% of workers cannot afford to buy an average 2 or 3 bed home in Great Britain. In spite of fast growth in rents, which is fair, only 27% cannot afford rental costs by comparison. They do make some of the most obvious conclusions you could imagine as well, of course. Access to housing is worse for single earners and for those on low incomes, for example. They also, as often, attempt to influence policy, building more smaller homes to buy, boosting the supply of rented homes and launching a market for long-term fixed-rate loans are key focus areas for government to start improving access to housing. It's really sensible stuff there, self-evidently true, some of it. The long-term fixed-rate loan market, just as rates are right up there with long-term averages and feel really high to many compared to the previous years, might be a tough sell to the consumers. You do feel that if the market wanted it, the market would have demanded it, but perhaps not. There's plenty of readers and listeners who will wish they had fixed for 10, 20 or 30 years in 2021, but hindsight is indeed 2020, and there were no options to do so outside of larger commercial loans that were still not that cheap at the time. You can see Zoopla's point. Work on the supply first, then worry about the demand second. Create the product and extol the virtues. The larger report talks about why affordability matters, which I don't think we need to dwell upon. We know that the most disadvantaged will suffer the most. It's a hugely important area for the future of the economy, aside from anything else, because housing is a basic need. Zoopla sticks with 30% of earnings spent on rental costs that the ONS uses. On the bright side, it does make the reports directly comparable. I think 33.33% might be a better metric personally, but these boundaries are somewhat arbitrary, as I said earlier, and it isn't a fight that we need to have. If the big dogs say 30%, we can accept that. The starkness of the data shows itself nowhere more than in London, of course. 74% of London workers can't buy. 58% can't buy in southern England. That looks more like 15 to 30% across the rest of Great Britain. Most respond by taking longer commutes or buying smaller homes when they can't buy what or where they want or need to. The same trend plays out for rentals. 67% of workers in London can't afford rental costs for a 2 or 3 bed home. 32% can't afford it across the south. That number is 20% across the rest of Britain and 14% in the Midlands and the north of England. Outside of London, York stands out as particularly unaffordable, with 61% not being able to afford to buy. Manchester's the outlier in rental affordability, as 56% can't afford to rent a 2 or 3 bed. Nottingham also makes the top 7 unaffordable rental areas, with 38% not being able to afford it, which almost certainly offers opportunities near Nottingham for more affordable rental stock, and people will commute from around the wider East Midlands area. Places that can get into Nottingham quickly, 12 minutes on the train from Ilkeston, for example. I must declare an interest there, as I've got some stock there. Then, interesting data on the product mix. More than 60% of PRS properties are 1 or 2 bed, with good availability of smaller, lower priced homes. More than 75% of owner-occupier homes are 3+ beds. This is all well and good, but do people want to own 1-bed properties if they're not rentals? 2 beds are definitely up for discussion, but a 2-bed is only a family home to a small family, of course. It isn't that people are having fewer children per childbearing woman. Fewer women are having children at all when you look at the data. Zoopla then addresses how to improve affordability. High loan to value doesn't work in the south, for example, because of the regulations in the marketplace. Smaller homes and bigger deposits are helpful, of course. They then rely on the English Housing Survey data, remember, again, only until March 2023, and point out that the stats in there are that full-time earners spend 27% of income on rent, and those without any housing benefit element spend 31% on rent. So if you use 35% as affordable, it makes rent affordable in the south of England to 84% of workers. And if you stick with that 35, still half of the working population of London can't afford it. But remember the percentage argument. Single earners are poorly served. I think that the nature of today's housing market is such that it's pricey to live alone unless you've paid off a mortgage over time. Only 25% can afford to buy on one income in the south and London. 3-bed family homes are in incredible demand and undersupplied by the market, but actually 2 beds have more of a mismatch. 20% of first-time buyers want them, but only 9% of the new build supply is a 2-bed house. The comparison is 49% who want a 3-bed and 33% of built stock being a 3-bed. 36% of new build stock is a 4-bedroom house or above, and I've talked about this at great length before, with only 10% of first-time buyers looking for a 4-bed or above. This can only be resolved by government subsidy, or more government subsidy I should say, because the market is building what is demanded by the secondary sector and what makes the most profit. Zoopla makes the point, as they're often keen to, that the PRS hasn't changed materially in size since 2016. All the figures up until March 2023 show this to be true. It would be bonkers to contend that hasn't changed significantly in the past 18 months, but if we all want the data to be out before drawing that conclusion, then so be it. I've pointed out before that Rightmove have stated that 20% of stock to market at the moment is ex-rental and only 10% is being bought for rental. Ignore that at your peril. However, this is still ignoring a 5.5% or so move upwards in the population from 16 to 23. Perhaps that's closer to 6% when it's compounded, although it was held back a little by the pandemic. This is a material shift in new renters, and since March 2023, net migration has also still been historically high by the historic standards anyway. This would really match the minimum growth in the PRS to ensure it is functioning as it was in 2015-16, not that it was perfect then. They also comment on new towns. In the old new towns, the split was 50-50 own and rent. Now it's 70% owned and 30% for low-cost ownership or affordable rent. This is on the plans anyway. The report continues looking at mortgage data, and what's very clear is just how much the stress test is holding people back. This is a serious problem and knocking out a ton of people from the market quite clearly when stress tests are as high as they are. Take them out with 30 or 40 year fixes or whatever's needed, and it would open up a lot of options The rates would be higher than Zoopla have proposed. This report was clearly done pre-budget and recent gilt yield moves, but with one fell swoop, you really could create a lot of extra affordability. Rent would still continue to be quite a bit more affordable though, and these calculations never take into account what you could do with the deposit, invest it, spend it, etc. Nevertheless, the conclusions are clearly valid. All in all, it's a very interesting pair of reports that will, no doubt, be largely ignored at policy level, which is a shame. Improve the PRS by improving social stock, that's what the government's trying to do, but with less than 10% of the money that it will take to achieve it, sadly. Often in these reports, it's what's not said that's the most interesting. For example, what's not explored are construction costs and their inflation, and how much that's changed the viability of many new build sites, or the idea that smaller minimum space standards, this wouldn't necessarily need to be across the board, could mean a much better supply of housing, especially when well designed. Much more thought needs to be put into that, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, it's perfectly fine for a person to live in a 6.6 square metre room in an HMO with a living room or kitchen that's shared, but with a one-bed flat for one person needs 37.5 square metres. That makes no sense at all and is incongruent. Secondly, excellent design, which is available without going back to the drawing board all over the developed world, means that amenities don't need to be compromised. Smaller units are the way forward in this world to fit more on a site, and also on larger schemes, use some of the saved space for value-adding amenities. This is a conversation that needs to be had. If you could cut space requirements for social homes by 20%, you could build up to 25% more of them for a similar cost. That's a couple of extra thoughts, not designed to be controversial, but to solve these problems you need to accept you must have difficult conversations. Now, before I call it for this week, a reminder about the tickets for the next Property Business Workshop. Thursday the 16th of Jan 2025, some fantastic subject matter, planning, efficiencies, financial accounting and bookkeeping, not how to use Xero, but how to ensure reporting is set up correctly and how to monitor it on an effective, ongoing, monthly basis. Come along and also get your strategic planning sorted out, and your January kick up the backside comes as part of the package as well. Those super early bird tickets, only a couple left, 25% plus face value discount. Once they're gone, they're gone. These events do sell out. Rod and I hope to see you there. Buy one at bit.ly/PBW5. And look, there's only one way to deal with all this ongoing noise and excitement. Keep calm, always read or listen to the supplement, and carry on. I'm now just going to address a couple of bits that have come up in the comments that are quite useful from this week. Thank you, Michael, for contributing here. He does say the government give £1 and take £2 back. That's pretty much always been the case with tax one way or another, I think. And then he says, council tax money doesn't go to the local council, but to some shareholders. I can only assume he means things like private finance initiatives and the likes. And of course, many public services are provided privately, and this is controversial, but unfortunately you can often find, and the whole history, the spine of privatisation has been that ultimately the private sector can provide with more efficiency, which means that the cost can go down. So I'm afraid from the evidence that I've examined, which includes looking at economies in Scandinavia and the likes, the best way normally is private provision of public services. Now, if Fergal Sharkey's listening, I'm sure he'd want to shoot me in the head for saying that, because ultimately water is a massive example of a huge market failure. I would say the primary reason for the failure there is that, apart from anything else, the last administration were not too bothered about one of the key parts of privatising utilities or monopolies or both, right? And one of those key parts is a proper watchdog or regulator with teeth. So Ofwat has not been that, and that needs a complete overhaul if you are going to keep water privatised. And you could look at the water system in many other developed nations which is not privatised and point to those as having better outcomes. But before we all get carried away with all of that and renationalisation, this is very typical management talk of restructuring, onshoring, offshoring, all the rest of it. It's a long cycle that goes on and repeats itself again and again, and ultimately what we don't want is just to spend loads more money and get a worse outcome. Anyone who is listening to this who remembers British Rail, for example, it was so bad it was beyond a bad joke. It was utterly horrific, and there was a massive increase in the number of people using trains when the private sector got involved. There's now huge public support to renationalise. That's the route that we're going down anyway, and I'm not suggesting this is not that the private sector have done a brilliant job, certainly on some of those lines, but you do need to bear in mind, I like to just keep these things back to the facts and the evidence, and ultimately public sectors normally mean gigantic amounts of bureaucracy red tape and wasted money. And we'll see the evidence of that or not based on what's going to happen in the US when Donald Trump is president and Elon Musk in his interesting role alongside Vivek Ramaswamy gets stuck into this Department of Government Efficiency. I'm perhaps less hopeful than I could be because I do fear some pretty bad outcomes for some parts of American society, but I don't doubt that they'll be able to increase efficiencies massively apart from anything else. So I hope that goes some way to addressing some of the comments and a bit broader. Thank you very much for listening. Hope to see you again. Tune in next week. Thank you.